Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here, and today I'd like to talk to you about writing a philosophy paper. This is the first video in a series of videos on writing philosophy papers, and today the topic is scholarship versus philosophizing. Now, in my teaching experience, which has, of course, too many years that I'm going to admit to, I've found that there is a fundamental confusion, namely between the notion of scholarship and the notion of philosophizing. That is, in this confusion, students often think that it's just the same thing. They roll it all together. And by doing that, students often cause themselves a lot of grief. And I'll talk about exactly what can happen if you make this confusion between the two. However, I want to start off by being very clear that scholarship and philosophizing are indeed related. Right? It's not the case that there's no overlap, but what I'm trying to point out is they're not identical. All right, so this fundamental confusion of scholarship is philosophizing is something that we're going to have to rule out, and it'll make your life a lot easier when you're taking philosophy courses. And by a philosophy course here, I'm really talking about a standard undergraduate course in philosophy offered by a philosophy faculty or a philosophy department where you study something like history of philosophy or the great philosophers, or perhaps a course in ethics or epistemology or metaphysics, something along those lines. Now, again, scholarship and philosophizing are related, but they're not the same thing. So, because this distinction between scholarship and philosophizing is rather subtle and can be difficult, and that's why a lot of students just simply don't even realize when they're making this confusion or having this confusion, I'm going to try and explain the confusion by starting with something that might be a little bit more obvious. So instead of scholarship versus philosophy, let's consider scholarship versus creative writing. So, suppose you're taking a course on Shakespeare. Well, let's start with that. Your professor would no doubt say, okay, in the course you're going to have to write an essay on some work of William Shakespeare. You might read Hamlet or Macbeth or The Tempest, one of his plays or maybe more, and then you will have to write an essay on them. Now, your essay on Shakespeare, of course, is not going to itself be a play. Shakespeare wrote plays, and when you write on Shakespeare, you're not going to write a play. So what was Shakespeare doing? Well, to write an essay on Shakespeare would be scholarship. What's he doing? He's doing creative writing, for lack of a better term, or playwriting, whatever term you wish to use. Again, the point is that what you're going to be doing in a course on Shakespeare is not to be simply identified with what Shakespeare is doing. So when you go and write your essay on Shakespeare, you're going to be looking at various journals and books on Shakespeare. You might consult essays on Shakespeare that are in the journals like the Shakespeare Survey or the Shakespeare Quarterly, where scholars engage in scholarship on Shakespeare. They write about the plays, examine the plays, the social context, all the kinds of issues that could be going on in the play, what shapes a character, all these kinds of things. What shapes Shakespeare's life, but they're not doing creative writing. You're not going to find plays in something like the Shakespeare Survey, the Shakespeare Quarterly, both journals, or in, let's say, a Cambridge Guide to Shakespeare. So what I want you to be clear about here is that studying Shakespeare is very different than trying to do creative writing like Shakespeare did. So with this distinction in mind between scholarship and creative writing, and of course there is creativity in scholarship, so they're not totally different, but don't think they're the same. Okay, now with this in mind, let's go back to philosophizing and scholarship. Now I've rearranged these a little bit so that you can get a good idea of how to keep them apart and start to think about how they are related, but again, don't equate the two. Now, let's use a simple example, one that's similar to the one I used on Shakespeare. Suppose you are taking not a course on Shakespeare, but now you're taking a course on Plato. Again, just a standard undergraduate course on Plato. You're going to be reading, in this little example, one of Plato's great dialogues called the Theaetetus. Now, Plato, of course, he's writing his philosophy, he is philosophizing, his philosophy was written in the form of dialogues. So characters would get together, they would often drink wine, eat figs, sit around and argue about things in philosophy. Usually the conversation and the debates were led by Socrates. Not in all of the dialogues, but in most of them. So Plato is clearly writing philosophy, engaging in philosophizing. So when you come to the course, it's good for you not to think that you're going to engage in philosophizing in the exact same way that Plato did. You're going to be engaging in scholarship. In this case, you're going to be asked in this little course, this example, you're going to be asked to write an essay on Plato. And you're going to be asked, say, to write an essay on the Theaetetus. You're going to try and figure out, to evaluate just what is going on in the Theaetetus. What are the characters talking about? Again, like in the Shakespeare example, you're not trying to be another character or write another character. You're trying to talk about what the characters are talking about, how they relate to each other, and the kinds of points the characters are trying to make. So you're going to be engaging in scholarship. How do you do that? Where's your beginning point? Well, you're going to enter into the scholarship part of your course, not by sitting back and thinking, but by actively engaging in pre-existing scholarship. So here, for instance, you'll be looking up journals that are related to philosophy, essentially philosophy journals and databases. Here we've got JSTOR, a great database, lots of articles for decades have been stored in there. You can find all kinds of stuff. It's searchable. Go in, have a look, find articles that look relevant to Plato's Theaetetus. Same thing, the Philosopher's Index, another great database that you can look up articles on, and it contains articles that are a little more recent than in JSTOR. JSTOR being journal storage. And of course, L'Année Philologique, which is a great database for all kinds of articles on the ancient world. A bit broader, but lots of philosophy in there too. And of course, another good reference for scholarship, especially introductory stuff, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is an online, free access journal or a database, and it has lots and lots of articles that are very helpful. And it will indeed be something that you can look up and get articles that will be very relevant to your discussion of Plato and the Theaetetus. There's, of course, all the journals. Here's an example of Phronesis, which is one of the journals that you will no doubt come across in your investigation, in your scholarship, your scholarly activities on Plato, and, of course, lots of books. And again, as I'm stressing, just even virtue of the layout of my slide here, Plato is engaging in philosophizing, you reading Plato, trying to analyze, trying to figure out what's going on in the Theaetetus, are engaging in scholarship. And there are resources. You take advantage of those resources by going to JSTOR, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, various books, journals, to read what authors, scholars have already said on the Theaetetus, so you can get some ideas about what to write about. So, a little practical advice. So when you make this distinction between philosophizing and scholarship, it's very important to keep in mind that you should not be sitting down when you write your essay and doing this, basically staring at the wall and wondering what you're going to write about. If you do that, then chances are you are making that confusion between philosophizing and scholarship. You're thinking that when the professor assigns an essay in philosophy on Plato or any other philosophical topic, that really what philosophers do is we just sit around and stare at the wall and think really, really hard until something just poof appears. You have an epiphany. Well, that's really not how it works. That staring at the wall is really a dead end. What you get of that is something like this. You will start getting worried and frustrated because ideas just don't work that way. You have to situate your thinking. If you don't, if you just stare at the wall, you'll end up in a dead end and you'll have wasted time, lots of frustration, increasing nervousness because your deadline is approaching, you're not getting much done. And in my experience, when students do this and they sit and just think and they don't read the journals, they don't engage in the scholarship, they end up writing diaries, beginning their works like, well, for thousands of years, philosophers have been wondering about the Theaetetus. And then we get a little story about the students' frustrations with trying to write the paper, and then it ends by saying, and philosophers will no doubt continue to wonder about the Theaetetus. This, if you find yourself writing this kind of stuff, you're probably, as I said, making that confusion between scholarship and philosophizing. And you'll end up extremely frustrated at the end of the day, and the course and all the exercises and everything connected to it won't be exactly a terribly pleasant experience. So, remember, make the separation between scholarship and philosophizing. Read your text. Read the course materials very carefully. Of course, you would read the Theaetetus very closely, but that's not all you read. So, for more practical advice, think about what research really means. You do research in philosophy. Research in philosophy is not thinking and staring at the wall and hoping some idea will just strike you or the muse will hit. It doesn't work that way. Research has a number of definitions, but a rough sort of idea of research can be something like this. When you're going to write that essay on the Theaetetus, you're going to be looking through pre-existing scholarship. You might have read something in the Theaetetus that you liked, maybe one of the definitions of knowledge that you thought was interesting. Well, you would be then saying, okay, I might want to write on the second definition of knowledge in the Theaetetus, but where do you start? Well, you look through pre-existing scholarship. Other scholars have written on that. What did they say about it? What did they think was important or not important? What are people arguing about? That's what you're going to find in the pre-existing scholarship. You'll find relevant essays. Sometimes you'll find lots of essays that are not relevant. You have to follow your nose and go through the pre-existing scholarship in order to find the relevant essays, relevant books, relevant journals that you will use to eventually construct your own topic. You might decide to look at a debate on, let's say, the second definition of knowledge, and different scholars have taken different sides and they're arguing about what Plato might have meant. Well, you should think of that as a conversation. And when you try to jump into a conversation, you don't just jump in, you sit down at the table, figure out what people are talking about. Read the essays, get an idea of where the debate is, what people are arguing about, different interpretations. That's research, going through the scholarly literature, immersing yourself in the conversations and the relevant speakers in those conversations, and then eventually, through this reading and the thinking about what you've read, you will eventually construct your own topic and a subsequent essay will unfold. And if you do it that way, that is, you don't stare at the wall. As the great philosopher Wittgenstein once said, he said to philosophers, stop thinking and look. And that's in a way what I'm trying to present to you here. Don't just think about your essay topic. Start looking, start researching, looking through the pre-existing scholarship. You do that, and you're going to be a lot more successful. It will be a lot more pleasant. And in that sense, you're going to conduct real research, which is not just simply looking at the wall and thinking, but looking and reading and thinking through pre-existing research and then eventually constructing your own ideas out of that. Research is like adding gas to the engine, and that will make it go, and that will lead you down the road to success. Thank you.